Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the scriptorium of a desert monastery where paper meets eternity. Not the simple copying of ancient texts, but the birth of entirely new forms of beauty that had never existed before. Hybrid art that spoke across languages, literatures that wove together the wisdom of 3 continents, and the quiet revolution that transformed how civilizations could share their souls. If you find wonder in these moments where cultures touch and create something unprecedented, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about your own experiences with creative fusion. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected through these acts of cultural bridge building. So dim the lights. Let's begin with monk Dharmakandra in the pre-dawn darkness of Dunhuang, his brush hovering over mulberry paper, about to copy words that would carry the accumulated wisdom of the Silk Road into an uncertain future. Chapter 8. Art, Literature, and Cultural Synthesis. In the pre-dawn darkness of a desert oasis, before the muezzin's call would drift across the sand dunes and the Buddhist bells would chime from stone caves carved into distant cliffs, a different kind of awakening stirred in the scriptorium of Dunhuang's great monastery. Monk Dharmakandra, his name itself a testament to the cultural currents flowing through this crossroads city, carefully unrolled a fresh sheet of mulberry paper, that miraculous Chinese invention that had revolutionized the world of letters. The paper felt cool and slightly textured beneath his fingertips, its surface ready to receive the wisdom of ages. Around him, in the gentle glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with scrolls, other scribes were already at work. The soft scratch of brush against paper created a meditative rhythm, one that seemed to harmonize with the distant tinkling of camel bells. Merchants arriving with the pre-dawn caravan from Samarkand. Through the open windows, the morning air carried the sweet fragrance of saffron that had traveled impossible distances to reach this desert haven. On the table before Dharmakandra lay texts in a dozen scripts. Sanskrit palm leaves yellow with age, Sogdian documents on Chinese paper, Tibetan scrolls written in bold strokes, and Persian illuminated pages where gold leaf caught the lamplight like trapped stars. Here was a world where wisdom traditions flowed together, like streams converging in an oasis. The young monk paused in his work, his brush hovering above a passage describing the Buddha's teaching to a gathering of diverse disciples. How fitting, he thought, that he should be copying these words in a place where cultures mingled in the dusty streets outside. The very act of translation had become an act of cultural creation, each brushstroke carrying not just the original meaning, but the accumulated understanding of all who had touched these teachings as they traveled the great routes from India through Central Asia to China. Through the scriptorium's doorway, Dharmakandra could see into the temple courtyard where morning prayers were beginning. The scene would have amazed visitors from distant lands. Monks chanting in Sanskrit while merchants offered silk banners, officials burned incense, and converts prostrated before Buddha statues whose faces showed subtle traces of artistic techniques inherited from distant Gandhara. The very stones seemed to hold memories of Alexander's armies, Kushan kings, and Silk Road caravans, stretching back through centuries of cultural flowering. This was more than a monastery. It was a living museum of human creativity, where the artistic traditions of half the known world converged in daily acts of devotion, scholarship, and cultural preservation. The manuscripts being created here would outlive empires, carrying forward the synthesized wisdom of countless generations who had walked the Silk Road's dusty paths. The seeds of artistic flowering. Long before the great cultural renaissance that would bloom in Tang Dynasty China, the seeds of artistic synthesis were being planted in the workshops of distant Gandhara. Here, In the mountainous borderlands of present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, something unprecedented was taking shape in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the world's first artistic fusion that would echo across continents and centuries. Master Apollodorus, whose very name betrayed his Greek heritage, worked carefully in his stone carving workshop near Peshawar, the warm afternoon light filtering through wooden lattice windows onto his workbench. Before him lay a piece of gray schist, its surface waiting to receive the image that had been commissioned by the local Buddhist monastery. But this would be no ordinary religious sculpture. For Apollodorus was part of a revolutionary moment in art history, when Greek techniques met Buddhist spirituality to create an entirely new visual language. His hands moved with practiced precision as he carved the flowing robes of a Buddha figure. The drapery fell in natural folds, each crease carefully modeled to suggest the weight of real fabric, techniques that would have been recognized in the workshops of ancient Athens. Yet the face emerging from the stone carried the serene expression of enlightenment, the half-closed eyes that spoke of Buddhist meditation and inner peace. In the workshop beside him, his colleague Rahula offered quiet suggestions about the proper symbolic gestures that would convey specific teachings to the faithful. The Buddha's hair followed Greek conventions for depicting curly locks, yet each curl was arranged as a symbol of spiritual attainment. Most remarkably, these Greek-featured Buddhas wore expressions of profound inner peace that seemed to bridge two worlds of understanding. As Apollodorus worked, the sounds of the cosmopolitan city filtered through his workshop. Merchants calling prices in multiple languages, Buddhist chanting mixing with Zoroastrian fire ceremonies, the clip-clop of horses carrying diplomatic envoys between distant empires. This was Gandhara at its cultural height, a place where Mediterranean artistic traditions encountered Indian spirituality, creating hybrid forms that would travel the Silk Road to transform the art of Central Asia and China. The statues emerging from workshops like his would become more than religious objects. They were cultural ambassadors, carrying Greek sculptural techniques eastward along the trading routes. When Buddhist merchants and pilgrims encountered these Greco-Buddhist sculptures, they saw their faith expressed through the most sophisticated artistic techniques then known to the world. A relief showing the Buddha's birth might use Greek techniques for modeling the human form while employing Indian conventions for depicting divine radiance. The result was art that spoke to audiences from multiple cultural backgrounds, each group finding familiar elements within an innovative synthesis that enlarged the possibilities of sacred art. By the 3rd century, Gandharan influence was visible in Buddhist sites, from Bamiyan in Afghanistan to Kucha in western China. The great Buddha statues carved into the cliffs at Bamiyan showed clear traces of Gandharan influence in their treatment of drapery and facial features, even as they adapted to local Central Asian preferences and materials. This artistic diffusion was not simple copying but creative adaptation. Each cultural center that encountered Gandharan art forms transformed them according to local tastes and spiritual emphases. The rigid naturalism of Greek sculpture gave way to more stylized forms that emphasized spiritual rather than physical beauty, while the symbolic vocabulary expanded to incorporate elements from diverse wisdom traditions. The manuscripts being created in Dharmakandra's scriptorium at Dunhuang were, in many ways, the literary equivalent of Gandharan sculpture, hybrid forms that combined elements from multiple traditions to create something new and culturally powerful. Just as Greek sculptural techniques had been adapted to express Buddhist spirituality, so too were narrative forms from different cultures being woven together to create new forms of literature that could speak to the cosmopolitan audiences of the Silk Road cities. The Sogdian Cultural Renaissance. As these artistic traditions took root in Central Asian soil, they encountered the commercial genius and cultural sophistication of the Sogdians, those master intermediaries, who would transform scattered influences into a coherent renaissance. In the 6th century, the city of Panja, Kent, stood as perhaps the most vivid example of this cultural flowering, a place where merchant wealth created the patronage necessary for artistic experimentation on an unprecedented scale. The Great Hall of Wakshuvar's mansion bore witness to this cultural synthesis on a summer evening in 580 CE, when the walls themselves seemed to pulse with life and color. 15 feet above the marble floors, elaborate frescoes unfolded in horizontal bands, their pigments as fresh and vibrant as the day the artists had mixed distant lapis lazuli with local mineral clays. Wakshuvar himself, his silk robes shimmering with threads dyed in precious saffron, moved among his guests with the easy grace of a man comfortable in multiple worlds. Tonight, his hall hosted a gathering that would have been impossible anywhere else on earth. A Chinese diplomatic envoy, recently arrived from Chang'an, a Buddhist monk from Kashmir, carrying manuscripts that required translation, a Zoroastrian priest whose fire temple had commissioned new ritual vessels, and a Persian minstrel whose songs carried echoes of Sasanian court poetry. The evening's entertainment perfectly captured the cultural fusion that had become Panjakent's hallmark. Musicians played instruments that told the story of Silk Road exchange in their very construction. A pear-shaped lute whose form had traveled from Persia through Central Asia, its soundboard inlaid with mother-of-pearl from distant Pacific shores. A zither whose strings followed Chinese musical scales but whose decorative motifs showed Iranian influence. As the evening progressed, guests were treated to performances that seamlessly blended traditions from across the known world. A storyteller recited episodes from Rustam's adventures against the demons, but his narrative technique showed clear influence from Buddhist literature, with its emphasis on moral instruction and karmic consequences. Dancers performed the Sogdian whirl, that ecstatic spinning dance that had become famous from Beijing to Byzantium, their movements accompanied by music that wove Persian melodies through Central Asian rhythmic patterns. The walls of this remarkable room preserved what may be the most complete record of Sogdian cultural synthesis ever discovered. The top register showed religious ceremonies where different faith traditions mingled freely. The middle section transported viewers into the world of Persian epic poetry, but this was not simply Iranian literature translated into visual form. Sogdian artists had transformed these future verses of the Shahnameh into a distinctly Central Asian vision, where heroes wore armor that combined Persian, Chinese, and nomadic elements, and fought demons that bore features drawn from local shamanic traditions, as well as Zoroastrian mythology. What made these frescoes extraordinary was not just their cultural breadth, but their artistic sophistication. The Sogdian painters had developed a distinctive style that combined naturalistic modeling techniques, inherited from Gandharan art, with the flat, decorative approaches favored in Persian and Chinese painting. Figures showed realistic proportions and spatial relationships, yet were rendered in brilliant colors that created an overall decorative magnificence. The techniques employed by these artists reveal the international character of Sogdian cultural networks. The preparation of walls followed Roman fresco methods, while pigments came from across the known world: ultramarine from Afghan lapis lazuli, cinnabar from China, gold leaf from India. The brushes and tools showed influence from Chinese painting techniques, while compositional principles drew from Persian manuscript illumination and Buddhist temple painting traditions. Perhaps most significantly, these Sogdian artists had developed their own iconographic vocabulary that could communicate across cultural boundaries. A figure's costume might combine elements from Chinese court dress, Persian royal regalia, and Central Asian nomadic clothing to indicate high status while appealing to viewers from different backgrounds. Religious symbols were similarly synthesized. Buddhist lotus motifs combined with Zoroastrian fire symbols and Chinese dragon imagery created decorative elements that carried meaning for diverse audiences while creating new aesthetic possibilities. The influence of Sogdian artistic synthesis extended far beyond the walls of wealthy merchants' homes. Portable objects created in Sogdian workshops, silk textiles with characteristic roundel patterns, silver vessels decorated with multicultural mythological scenes, jewelry that combined techniques from multiple traditions, carried these hybrid aesthetic vocabularies throughout the Silk Road network. When these objects reached markets in Chang'an, Constantinople, or Delhi, they influenced local artistic production and contributed to the creation of new hybrid forms. The literary culture that flourished alongside this artistic renaissance was equally sophisticated and cosmopolitan. Sogdian poets and writers, working in a language that had become the lingua franca of Silk Road commerce, created works that drew inspiration from the great literary traditions of Persia, India, China, and the Mediterranean world. Epic poetry in the Sogdian language incorporated narrative techniques from Persian court literature, character development from Buddhist stories, and structural elements from Chinese historical writing. The merchant families who patronized this cultural renaissance were not merely passive consumers, but active participants in the creative process. Men like Wakshuvar traveled extensively throughout the Silk Road network, bringing back artistic objects and literary texts from distant lands. These collections became raw material for local artists and writers to study, adapt, and transform according to their own aesthetic visions and the tastes of their cosmopolitan clientele. Yet the cultural synthesis that emerged in places like Punjab, Kent, transcended its commercial origins to become something genuinely innovative and aesthetically powerful. The Sogdians had not simply created artistic forms that sold well in diverse markets. They had developed new aesthetic possibilities that enlarged the expressive range of visual art, literature, and music. Their synthetic approach had demonstrated that cultural boundaries, rather than limiting artistic possibilities, could become sources of creative inspiration when crossed by artists with sufficient skill and vision. The Tang cosmopolitan flowering. Meanwhile, in the great cities of the Tang Empire, the cultural currents that had been flowing eastward along the Silk Road converged in an explosion of artistic creativity that would establish China as the cosmopolitan center of the medieval world. Chang'an in 742 CE was arguably the most culturally diverse city on Earth, home to over 1 million inhabitants who spoke dozens of languages and had brought with them the artistic traditions of half the known world. In the western quarter of the capital, near the Great West Market where foreign merchants established their shops, stood the workshop compound of Master Liu Xingjian, the most celebrated craftsman in an empire renowned for artistic achievement. On this particular morning in early spring, his workshops hummed with creative activity that would have astonished visitors from less cosmopolitan societies. The sounds that filled the courtyards told the story of cultural synthesis. the rhythmic hammering of Persian silversmiths working alongside Chinese masters, the scratch of brushes as artists painted silk banners, the delicate chiming of bronze bells being tuned by musicians whose understanding drew from Greek mathematics, Indian musical theory, and Chinese ceremonial traditions. The objects emerging from these workshops were destined for the most exclusive clientele, the imperial court, wealthy aristocratic families, and foreign embassies that required gifts appropriate for distant rulers. Each piece represented not merely superior craftsmanship, but cultural sophistication of the highest order, the ability to synthesize aesthetic elements from across Eurasia into forms that appeared both familiar and wonderfully exotic to Chinese eyes. In the textile workshop, artisans created silk hangings that perfectly captured the Tang aesthetic of cosmopolitan luxury. The designs being woven into these silks told the story of Tang China's cultural openness. Persian hunting scenes where mounted kings pursued lions. Buddhist paradise gardens filled with lotus blossoms and celestial musicians. Central Asian roundel patterns that framed mythological creatures, and Chinese landscape elements that provided familiar reference points within compositions that celebrated the foreign and exotic. The Tang flower motif that decorated many of these textiles had become an emblem of the dynasty's cultural confidence. What appeared to be a purely Chinese decorative element was actually a synthesis of Persian palmettes, Indian lotus forms, and Chinese peony conventions. The resulting pattern possessed an organic vitality that had made Tang textiles prized from Japan to Byzantium, but its hybrid origins were visible to anyone familiar with the diverse artistic traditions from which it had been constructed. The workshop's most ambitious project was a series of silk banners commissioned for the upcoming visit of Japanese diplomatic envoys. These hangings would eventually make their way to the Shosoan repository in Nara, where they would survive for over a millennium as testimony to Tang China's cultural achievements. The designs incorporated elements from across the Tang Empire's sphere of influence. Buddhist paradise scenes executed in techniques that showed Central Asian influence, musical instruments whose forms revealed their Persian and Sogdian origins, and architectural elements that combined Chinese palatial motifs with foreign decorative details. The banner's iconographic program was particularly sophisticated, designed to communicate Tang cultural supremacy through the deliberate incorporation and transformation of foreign artistic elements. A scene showing celestial musicians included figures playing instruments from across Eurasia, Persian-style lutes with mother-of-pearl inlay, Central Asian drums, Chinese flutes, and zithers, whose tuning systems had been influenced by Greek mathematical concepts transmitted through scholarly networks. In the metalworking section of Master Liu's compound, Persian and Chinese artisans collaborated on pieces that pushed the boundaries of possibility. The most spectacular current project was a set of gold and silver vessels commissioned by Emperor Xuanzong himself for court ceremonies that would host foreign dignitaries. Each piece combined techniques from multiple traditions: Persian repoussé work, Chinese granulation, and inlay work, using precious stones from across the known world. A magnificent silver ewer demonstrated the sophistication of this cultural synthesis. Its basic form followed Persian prototypes, with an elegant pear-shaped body and graceful handle, but Chinese craftsmen had refined the proportions according to aesthetic principles derived from their own bronze working traditions. The decorative program combined elements from multiple sources: Persian hunting scenes rendered in Chinese painting conventions, Buddhist lotus motifs executed in Central Asian style, and Taoist immortals depicted with awareness of Zoroastrian symbolic traditions. The workshop's music section provided perhaps the most vivid example of Tang cultural synthesis in action. Here, instrument makers from across the empire worked together to create musical devices that could satisfy the cosmopolitan tastes of Tang elite society while maintaining technical excellence. The current focus was a magnificent pear-shaped lute, a pipa, being created for presentation to the Japanese embassy. Master Hu Dexin, whose surname revealed his Central Asian origins, supervised the lute's construction with meticulous attention to both aesthetic and acoustic considerations. The instrument's basic form followed traditions that had traveled eastward from Persian prototypes, but every element had been refined according to Chinese aesthetic principles. The proportions adjusted to accord with Chinese mathematical concepts. The decorative inlay executed using techniques that accommodated Persian and Central Asian design motifs. And the acoustic properties fine-tuned according to Chinese musical scales enriched through contact with Indian and Persian melodic conventions. The pipa's soundboard bore an extraordinary example of Tang decorative art, a design showing a Central Asian hunter pursuing a gazelle through a landscape of flowering trees and exotic birds. The hunter's costume combined elements from Persian court dress, Chinese military armor, and Central Asian nomadic clothing. The landscape employed Chinese painting conventions, but incorporated Persian textile patterns as decorative elements. The gazelle was rendered with naturalistic accuracy that showed Greek influence transmitted through Gandharan artistic traditions, while the flowering trees included species from across Eurasia, creating a paradise garden that represented the cultural diversity of the Tang Empire itself. When completed, this lutu would serve as a diplomatic gift that communicated Tang China's cultural sophistication to the Japanese court. Its hybrid aesthetic, recognizably Chinese, yet incorporating refined elements from Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions, would demonstrate the Tang Empire's position as inheritor and synthesizer of Eurasian cultural achievements. The workshop's production methods revealed the systematic nature of Tang cultural synthesis. Rather than simply copying foreign artistic forms, Chinese craftsmen had developed sophisticated methods for analyzing, adapting, and improving upon foreign techniques. Persian repoussé work was studied to understand underlying principles that could be applied to Chinese decorative programs. Central Asian textile patterns were examined for their structural logic, then adapted to create new patterns that maintained aesthetic appeal while incorporating Chinese symbolic elements. This systematic approach required institutional support unique to Tang China. The imperial workshops maintained libraries of foreign artistic objects that served as reference materials for craftsmen. Embassy gifts and tribute items were cataloged and made available to artists who needed to understand foreign aesthetic traditions. The workshops also employed foreign artisans, not merely as specialists, but as teachers who could transmit technical knowledge to Chinese apprentices, ensuring that foreign techniques became part of Chinese craft traditions. The results were visible throughout Tang society. In the great Buddhist monasteries of Chang'an, temple buildings combined Chinese architectural principles with decorative elements drawn from Indian, Central Asian, and Persian traditions. The painted sculptures that filled these temples showed faces that reflected awareness of Gandharan artistic traditions, wore costumes that incorporated international textile patterns, and were surrounded by architectural settings that combined Chinese palatial elements with foreign decorative details adapted to serve Buddhist iconographic programs. In the private residences of wealthy Chang'an families, Interior decoration celebrated the cosmopolitan character of Tang culture through systematic incorporation of foreign artistic elements within fundamentally Chinese domestic settings. Silk hangings displayed Persian hunting scenes rendered in Chinese painting techniques. Furniture combined Chinese joinery methods with decorative inlay work learned from Persian and Central Asian craftsmen. Garden designs incorporated exotic plants from across the Silk Road network within landscape concepts that remained recognizably Chinese. This cultural flowering reached its most systematic expression in the great imperial collections that were being assembled during this period. The objects that would eventually fill treasure houses like the Shoshoan Repository represented not merely the wealth of the Tang Empire, but its cultural sophistication, the ability to take the finest artistic traditions from across the known world and transform them into new forms of beauty that transcended their individual cultural origins, while remaining recognizably products of Tang Chinese civilization. The Great Translation Movement and Literary Renaissance. As the cultural synthesis visible in Tang material culture reached its height, a parallel revolution was transforming the world of literature through the most ambitious translation project in human history. The great manuscript repositories at Dunhuang, Turfan, and other oasis cities had become centers of literary activity that rivaled the famous libraries of Alexandria and Baghdad, but with a crucial difference. These Central Asian centers specialized in the systematic translation and adaptation of texts from dozens of languages and cultural traditions. Brother Fajing carefully examined the Sanskrit palm leaf manuscript that had arrived with the most recent caravan from Kashmir, his trained eye assessing both its textual significance and physical condition. The leaves bore the elegant curves of Devanagari script written in iron gall ink that had faded to warm brown after decades of travel. The text was a commentary on the Lotus Sutra, but what made this particular manuscript precious was its marginal annotations, notes written by Indian scholars that provided interpretations not found in any other version. Around Fajing, in the Dunhuang Translation Center, dozens of scholars worked at the complex process of rendering Indian wisdom into Chinese. The work required not merely linguistic skill but profound cultural sensitivity, for each language carried within it entire worldviews that did not always correspond to the assumptions of other cultures. Sanskrit, with its precise philosophical vocabulary developed over centuries, presented concepts that had no direct Chinese equivalents. Chinese, with its literary traditions stretching back over a millennium, offered expressive possibilities that were unknown in Sanskrit. By lamplight, Fajing listened as native speakers of Sanskrit read through texts and provided oral explanations, their voices weaving meaning across the gulf between languages. Chinese scholars with knowledge of Buddhist philosophy suggested terms that might capture essential meanings, while others worked to ensure consistency with established conventions, while remaining alert to opportunities for improvement. The process unfolded with the rhythm of careful scholarship, question and response, suggestion and refinement, the gradual emergence of understanding from the patient work of cultural bridge-building. The manuscripts that emerged were far more than simple translations. They were new literary creations that adapted Indian spiritual insights to Chinese cultural contexts while preserving essential meaning. A Sanskrit term like dharma, which carried complex associations developed over centuries of Indian religious thought, might be translated using Chinese characters that evoked related but distinctly Chinese concepts. creating hybrid meanings that were neither purely Indian nor purely Chinese, but something genuinely new. The physical production of these translated manuscripts required resources that demonstrated the sophistication of Silk Road cultural networks. The paper represented one of China's greatest technological contributions to world civilization, a writing material that was lighter, more durable, and far cheaper than the palm leaves or parchment used elsewhere. But the inks and binding materials came from across the known world. Cinnabar from Central Asian mines, fine brushes made from animal hair found in distant forests, silk threads for binding from Chinese workshops that had perfected their craft over centuries. The decorative elements that adorned important manuscripts revealed the international character of Silk Road book culture. Illuminated Buddhist texts combined Indian iconographic traditions with Chinese painting techniques and Central Asian decorative patterns. A manuscript of the Diamond Sutra might feature Buddha figures rendered in the Gandharan style, but surrounded by landscape elements that showed Chinese influence, and decorative borders that employed Persian textile patterns adapted to manuscript decoration. The result was visual art that could communicate across cultural boundaries while creating new aesthetic possibilities. The translation movement was not limited to Buddhist texts, though these formed the largest category. Taoist philosophical texts were rendered into Sanskrit and Central Asian languages, carrying Chinese spiritual concepts westward. Persian Zoroastrian literature was translated into Chinese, introducing Chinese readers to Iranian mythological and ethical traditions. Manichaean texts, originally composed in Aramaic and Middle Persian, were translated into Chinese, Sogdian, and Turkish, spreading this syncretic religion throughout Central Asia. Even secular literature crossed cultural boundaries. Persian epic poetry was adapted into Chinese, while Chinese historical works were translated into Central Asian languages. The Sogdian scholars who participated in this movement deserve special recognition, for they often served as crucial intermediaries in the transmission of texts between languages that had little direct contact. A Buddhist text might travel from its original Sanskrit through Sogdian translation before being rendered into Chinese, with Sogdian scholars adding their own interpretive insights at each stage. The Sogdian language itself became a repository of international literary culture, with original works incorporating elements from Persian epic poetry, Buddhist narrative literature, Chinese historical writing, and local Central Asian oral traditions. The most remarkable aspect of this translation movement was its systematic character. Rather than simply rendering individual texts from one language to another, the scholars working in centers like Dunhuang were creating comprehensive libraries that made the intellectual achievements of multiple cultures available to readers from other backgrounds. An educated Chinese Buddhist in the 8th century could read, in translation, the major philosophical works of Indian Buddhism, the epic literature of Iran, the historical chronicles of Central Asian kingdoms, and even fragments of Greek philosophical texts that had been preserved through Persian scholarly traditions. The manuscripts being produced were not intended merely for local use but as contributions to an international scholarly network that connected monasteries, libraries, and courts, from Korea to Constantinople. Buddhist pilgrims traveling between India and China carried these translated texts as precious cargo, introducing Indian concepts to Chinese audiences while bringing Chinese interpretive innovations back to Indian scholarly circles. Sogdian merchants often served as patrons for translation projects that would benefit the cosmopolitan communities they had established throughout Central Asia. The influence of this translation movement extended far beyond religious and philosophical literature. Scientific texts from Greek and Persian traditions were rendered into Chinese, introducing mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge that would transform Chinese intellectual culture. Chinese poetry began to incorporate metrical patterns derived from Persian verse forms, while Persian epic poetry adopted narrative techniques learned from Chinese historical writing. Sanskrit Buddhist literature showed the influence of Chinese philosophical concepts, while Chinese Buddhist texts employed logical structures derived from Indian philosophical methods. One of the most striking examples of this literary synthesis can be found in the transformation narratives that became popular throughout the Silk Road region. These stories typically describe the magical transformation of characters from one cultural identity to another, serving as metaphors for the cultural synthesis occurring throughout Central Asian society. A typical narrative might begin with a Chinese princess who becomes a Persian warrior maiden, then transforms into a Buddhist goddess, and finally returns to human form as a Sogdian merchant woman. Each transformation would be described using literary techniques and cultural references drawn from the appropriate tradition, creating stories that served as virtual encyclopedias of Silk Road cultural knowledge. The preservation of this literary culture became increasingly urgent as political changes threatened the stability of trading networks. The Great Library Cave at Dunhuang, sealed sometime in the 11th century, represents one of the most successful attempts to preserve this international literary heritage. The 60,000 manuscripts found in that cave in 1900 constitute the largest and most diverse collection of Silk Road texts ever assembled, providing modern scholars with unprecedented insight into the literary culture that flourished during the height of cultural exchange. The imperial collections and cultural memory. The systematic preservation of cultural achievements reached its most sophisticated expression in the great imperial repositories that were being assembled during the height of Silk Road cultural exchange. Far across the Yellow Sea from the translation centers of Central Asia, in the Japanese capital of Nara, another kind of cultural synthesis was taking place, one that would create the most complete surviving record of 8th century Silk Road material culture. Empress Komyo stood in the treasure hall of Todaiji Temple on a misty autumn morning in 756, surrounded by the magnificent objects that had defined her husband Emperor Shomu's reign. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted a mother-of-pearl inlaid lute, a biwa whose pear-shaped form immediately revealed its foreign origins. The instrument had been crafted by Chinese artisans, using techniques learned from Sogdian masters, decorated with Persian motifs adapted to Chinese aesthetic preferences, and strung with silk processed, using methods originally developed in Indian workshops. The biwa's soundboard bore an extraordinary hunting scene, a mounted figure pursuing game animals through a landscape of flowering trees and exotic birds. The hunter's costume combined elements from Persian court dress and Chinese military armor, while his mount displayed the refined proportions that Central Asian horse breeders had achieved through centuries of careful selection. The landscape employed Chinese painting conventions but included flowering plants from across the Silk Road network, lotus blossoms from India, peonies from China, roses from Persia, creating a paradise garden that represented the cultural diversity of the Buddhist world. The mother-of-pearl inlay that created these images came from mollusks, harvested in the South China Sea, but the techniques for cutting and fitting the pieces had been developed in Persian workshops and refined through Chinese lacquerwork methods. The resulting decorative effects possessed both the luminous beauty prized in Chinese art and the intricate patterning favored in Persian traditions, creating visual experiences that transcended the aesthetic boundaries of any single cultural tradition. Around the biwa in the temple treasury lay hundreds of other treasures that chronicled the artistic achievements of Silk Road exchange. Silk textiles displayed Persian hunting scenes rendered in Chinese weaving techniques. Gold and silver vessels showed forms derived from Persian prototypes, but executed using Chinese metalworking methods. Glass bowls displayed the sophisticated knowledge of Middle Eastern craftsmen, while bearing decorative patterns that revealed awareness of Chinese ceramic traditions. Perhaps the most remarkable single object was a sandalwood and ivory chest, whose construction encapsulated the international character of 8th-century material culture. The carpentry followed Chinese traditions, with complex joinery that created strong construction without metal fasteners. The sandalwood had been imported from India, where its aromatic properties made it especially valued for religious purposes. The ivory came from Southeast Asian elephants, harvested according to methods developed over centuries of international trade. The chest's decorative program combined iconographic elements from across the Buddhist world. Lotus motifs executed in Indian style shared space with Chinese dragon imagery and Persian floral patterns. Buddhist narrative scenes employed compositional techniques that showed awareness of Gandharan sculptural traditions, while incorporating landscape elements familiar from Chinese painting conventions. The overall effect was decorative art that could communicate across cultural boundaries, while creating aesthetic experiences of unprecedented richness. The imperial robes preserved in the collection provided striking evidence of the textile arts' role in cultural exchange. One particularly magnificent garment, a 9-panel kesa that had been worn by Emperor Shomu himself, demonstrated the transformation of utilitarian religious clothing into high art. The basic construction followed traditional Buddhist requirements, but the execution employed the finest materials and most sophisticated techniques available. Silk fragments and colors achieved through dyes imported from across the trading network, stitching that followed Chinese needlework traditions refined through Persian influence, and design concepts that showed awareness of Central Asian textile patterns and Indian decorative traditions. The musical instruments provided particularly vivid evidence of cultural transmission. In addition to the mother-of-pearl inlaid biwa, the treasury contained examples of virtually every type of musical device that had traveled the trading routes. Persian-style lutes showed the westward spread of Chinese construction techniques, while Chinese zithers displayed decorative patterns that revealed Persian and Central Asian influence. Drums from Central Asia bore membrane heads prepared according to techniques from different traditions, but assembled using methods that combined the best features of each approach. The systematic character of this collection revealed the Japanese court's sophisticated understanding of its position within Silk Road cultural networks. Rather than simply acquiring exotic objects for their novelty value, the imperial collections had been assembled to demonstrate Japan's participation in the cosmopolitan Buddhist civilization that connected the monasteries and courts of Asia. Each object served multiple functions: religious significance for ceremonial purposes, diplomatic importance as evidence of international connections, and cultural value as examples of the highest artistic achievements of the international Buddhist community. The care with which these objects were preserved demonstrated awareness of their historical significance that was remarkable for its time. The Shosoin repository, specially constructed to house the imperial treasures, employed sophisticated climate control methods that would preserve organic materials for over a millennium. The wooden construction used interlocking timbers that expanded and contracted with seasonal humidity changes, creating natural climate control that protected silk textiles, wooden objects, and paper manuscripts from the deterioration that had destroyed most contemporary collections elsewhere. The inventories that recorded the collection's contents represented pioneering efforts in museum documentation and cultural preservation. Each object was carefully described, its provenance noted when known, and its cultural significance explained in terms that revealed sophisticated understanding of Silk Road cultural networks. These records, preserved alongside the objects themselves, provide modern scholars with unprecedented insight into 8th-century understanding of cultural exchange and international artistic influences. The international character of the collection reflected deliberate cultural policy on the part of the Japanese imperial court. Japan's position at the eastern terminus of Silk Road networks provided unique opportunities to acquire the finest products of international artistic exchange, but it also created obligations to serve as custodian for cultural treasures that represented the achievements of the entire Buddhist world. The imperial collections were intended not merely as private treasures, but as repositories of international cultural heritage that would preserve the artistic achievements of Silk Road civilization for future generations. The preservation of cultural memory. As the cultural flowering that had characterized the height of Silk Road exchange began to face challenges from changing political circumstances and shifting trade routes, the preservation of accumulated knowledge and artistic achievement became a matter of increasing urgency. The great repository caves at sites like Dunhuang represented systematic attempts to safeguard the cultural heritage of international exchange for future generations. The sealing of Dunhuang's library cave, probably in the early 11th century, marked both an ending and a beginning. As a Buddhist monk carefully arranged the final manuscripts and artworks in the hidden chamber by the light of flickering oil lamps, he was participating in one of history's most successful preservation efforts. Perhaps he whispered prayers for unknown future readers as he sealed away the wisdom of ages. 60,000 items that would remain hidden for 9 centuries, representing not just the library of a single monastery, but a comprehensive archive of Silk Road cultural achievement. The process of selection revealed sophisticated understanding of cultural value that transcended narrow sectarian interests. Buddhist texts in a dozen languages shared space with Taoist philosophical works, Manichaean religious literature, Nestorian Christian documents, and secular works that included everything from government records to folk songs. The preservation criteria seemed to emphasize cultural diversity and historical significance rather than doctrinal orthodoxy. The physical arrangement of materials demonstrated systematic archival methods that would be recognized by modern librarians. Related texts were bundled together, wrapped in silk protective covers, and arranged in sequences that suggested organizational principles based on subject matter, language, and historical period. Labels written in Chinese, Tibetan, and other languages provided finding aids that would allow future scholars to locate specific materials within the vast collection. The cave also contained numerous examples of portable art that had been preserved alongside the manuscripts. Silk paintings that rolled into compact bundles, wooden printing blocks that could reproduce texts and images, and small bronze sculptures that represented the finest achievements of international religious art. These objects, many showing clear evidence of extensive travel and use, had been selected not because of monetary value, but because of cultural significance as records of artistic exchange and religious synthesis. The printing blocks found in the cave deserve special attention as evidence of the technological sophistication that supported Silk Road cultural networks. These wooden blocks, carved with text and images that could be reproduced through printing, represented a revolutionary approach to cultural preservation and transmission. Rather than depending on hand copying, a slow, expensive, and error-prone process, printing technology allowed for rapid and accurate reproduction, making it possible to disseminate knowledge throughout the trading network with unprecedented speed and reliability. The famous Diamond Sutra scroll found in the cave, dated 868 CE, and bearing the inscription, "Made for universal free distribution by Wang Ji on behalf of his two parents," represents both the earliest dated printed book in existence and a powerful statement about the democratic potential of printing technology. The sutra's text, originally composed in India and translated into Chinese through collaborative international scholarship, could now be reproduced in unlimited quantities and distributed to anyone interested in Buddhist teaching, regardless of social status or economic resources. The manuscript culture preserved in caves like Dunhuang reveals the sophisticated international networks that had developed to support scholarly communication throughout the region. Letters written in Sogdian document correspondence between merchants and their business partners, revealing commercial relationships that had personal and cultural dimensions extending far beyond simple economic exchange. Bilingual dictionaries demonstrate the practical linguistic needs of polyglot communities, where people needed to communicate across cultural boundaries daily. The religious manuscripts provide compelling evidence of the syncretic spiritual culture that had emerged in Silk Road communities. Buddhist texts incorporate Taoist philosophical concepts, Manichaean literature employs Buddhist narrative techniques, and Nestorian Christian documents show awareness of Islamic theological arguments. The boundaries between religious traditions, rather than creating barriers, seem to have become sources of creative inspiration for spiritual seekers who found value in multiple wisdom traditions. The secular literature, folk songs, popular stories, administrative documents, personal letters, provides intimate glimpses into daily life in communities shaped by international cultural exchange. Chinese folk songs incorporate musical elements from Central Asian traditions. Persian epic poetry is adapted to Chinese literary conventions, and administrative documents reveal the practical challenges of governing multicultural communities, where different groups maintain their own customs while participating in shared systems. The preservation of this cultural archive was not an isolated achievement, but part of a broader pattern of cultural conservation that characterized the final centuries of classical Silk Road civilization. Similar repositories, though few as well preserved as Dunhuang's library cave, existed throughout Central Asia, each serving as part of a backup system for preserving the accumulated knowledge and artistic achievements of international cultural exchange. The scholars and religious practitioners who created these preservation systems demonstrated remarkable foresight in recognizing the historical significance of the cultural synthesis occurring around them. Rather than taking international cultural exchange for granted as a permanent feature of their world, they understood that political changes and economic disruptions could threaten the cosmopolitan civilization they had inherited, and they took systematic steps to preserve its achievements for future generations, who might live in very different circumstances. Their efforts proved remarkably successful. When explorers opened Dunhuang's library cave in 1907, they discovered not just a collection of old manuscripts, but a complete record of one of history's greatest experiments in international cultural cooperation. The objects and texts preserved there provide modern scholars with detailed documentation of cultural exchange processes that transformed artistic traditions, literary forms, scientific knowledge, and religious understanding throughout Eurasia. Epilogue: The Eternal Flowering. As we close this exploration of artistic and literary synthesis along the Silk Road, the morning sun rises once again over the desert oasis where our journey began. In the restored caves of Dunhuang, in the museums that house Silk Road treasures from Tokyo to London, in the concert halls where musicians still play instruments whose forms traveled ancient trading routes, the cultural achievements documented in these pages continue to enrich human experience and inspire new forms of creative expression. The story of Silk Road cultural exchange reminds us that some of humanity's greatest achievements emerge not from cultural isolation, but from the courageous willingness of artists, scholars, and spiritual seekers to cross boundaries, encounter difference, and discover the creative possibilities that exist in the spaces between traditions. The Buddha figures carved in distant Gandhara, the manuscripts preserved in Central Asian caves, the musical instruments that carried melodies across continents, and the textiles that wove together aesthetic traditions from around the world, all testify to the transformative power of cultural openness and mutual respect. In our own interconnected age, when digital networks allow for cultural exchange at speeds that would have astonished Silk Road merchants and scholars, we can find inspiration in their example of thoughtful, respectful cultural synthesis that honored the integrity of different traditions, while creating new possibilities for human creativity and understanding. The flowering of art and literature along the Silk Road continues to bloom in every act of cultural bridge building, every moment of creative synthesis, and every effort to preserve the cultural achievements of the past for the enrichment of future generations. Their legacy whispers to us across the centuries: in difference lies not danger, but the seeds of unprecedented beauty, waiting to blossom in the patient gardens of human creativity.